So I must say that I am beyond grateful and humbled to be participating in this conference. And thank you so much for the introduction. Um, to begin this contemplation, I sat very still for a very long time. What and how I am presenting is a bit of an experiment, something between a poetic reflection, an archive of grieving and affirmation. These fragments of grief interspersed with moments of clarity, with moments of quiet. First, I must thank all the previous presenters for their overwhelming, witnessing, moving, intense, clarifying, groundbreaking work, and for holding space and language for everyone else's work. Secondly, I must apologize and ask you for forgiveness in advance should my reflection open old wounds or incite new ones or repeat current ones. Usually, when speaking about one's work or practice, it is an ordered, systematic, sequence process for other people to access your thinking and logic and rationale and method and theoretical threads. I found that to be almost impossible this time around. Initially, there was a clear intention to structure the effects and affects of grief and how these might be spatialized. The imperative was to use the images as citation to orient grief and to contribute something to a genealogical narrative of mourning in solidarity and parallel, which catastrophe demands. I'm unsure of whether that has been achieved. In the process of expanding that intention, I became lost in the fragments of images in news and media, of voices of mourning, of constant, ever-present loss. This presentation is an offering of continued critique of traditional architectural practice and my own constant reluctance to embed myself fully in an academic position because I am suspicious of my own intellectual convictions. Additionally, in the wake of the destruction we are witnessing in real time, we are further compelled to consider what exists beyond the architectural brief, the building, and the notion of the architect as sole author. So today I'm offering a series of fragmentary images that are tethered in some ways, but they are thoughts, patches of lucidity, and part of the fragmentary whole. They are portals into lives and resistances which have and do exist, despite racialized, imposed identities and stereotypes, and in opposition to historical narratives that marginalized and peripheralized identities that says these identities were and are a danger to themselves, as well as to white supremacist rule. The images are somewhat connected and may appear linear or quickly flash by, as grief sometimes does. They are incidents, records, interruptions, exposures of the visceral, and remnants of the past. Most of the images have an overlay, an imprint, an offering of flowers, obscuring the main image. They are part of the story. I've become obsessed with this image. This was my maternal grandmother's house. She's pictured here with two of my younger cousins in afternoon sunlight. The house was in a segregated township to which my mother, her siblings, parents, aunts, uncles, and neighbors were moved to in the late 1950s after being forcibly removed from the city. I've redrawn, reimagined, restitched this image onto and into its erased context of an aerial photograph of 1938. It is either reinscribing grief or reinscribing memory of place. I haven't decided which. When this obsession emerged, I also found a map of the neighborhood drawn decades after that aerial photograph was taken. The map records no street names or blocks or by inference any people. This was a predominantly Black African neighborhood originally. It was drawn as an absence, as a blank space. I don't remember much about that house or neighborhood, but if grief is methodology, then it has become a mnemonic device and mechanism for reimagining the house, the street, the neighborhood, the city, and the people in it. This is a photograph of me and two of my cousins. This photograph is of my mom in the room that they called home. The building in which the room was located was demolished on the premise of sanitizing the area. If grief is archiving device, then it records that this was the first forced removal my mother and her parents and siblings experienced. In, in my context, there are few obviously visible remnants of the legislated past of racial segregation unless you care to look closely. There are few ruins in the expected sense. Instead, the infrastructures which enforced oppression are re-inhabited by democratic infrastructures. The shadow of the past remains in the present. Grief embeds in artifact, amplifying that even rest was segregated. No rest while living, no rest while deceased. This is an archive of grief. It is a collection of funeral pamphlets or mementos of remembrance. In many South African funeral traditions, these are produced for the day of the funeral to program the day and remember the deceased. When my grandmother died in February of 2021, we were still observing COVID protocols, so the standard rituals of getting a pamphlet with all her favorite hymns and notes of how the day would unfold could not be observed. There were no people gathering at the home before the funeral, on the day of the funeral, and after the funeral. I made the small laminated card instead, arranged the funeral, wrote and read the eulogy, arranged the cremation, arranged for the interment of her ashes, but that process remains incomplete. She would have found her final resting place here at West Park Cemetery, but that was not to be. Most of the popular, more accessible cemeteries in the city have reached capacity and cannot be expanded. So instead, my grandmother's ashes are in a container, in a floral box, in a cupboard, in a room, in a house, where my aunt lives in perpetual precarity in a neighborhood that saw one of the more prominent forced removals of Black people. My father and his parents and siblings among those who were moved in the 1950s to another neighborhood which also saw forced relocations on the premise of sanitizing. And now that place is rife with violent gangsterism and drug use and high contingent mortality rates. Also, my grand's ashes are kept there for now because the place she was to be interred has been vandalized, and the artifacts left by the living as mementos of the dead are stolen from the dead to spite the living. And when nothing valuable is found, destruction is the response. And so for 5 years, my grand's ashes remained unburied and loud, and another eulogy is needed. I wanted to collect all the eulogies I've written over the past decade and a half to talk about the space of formulating an end note for somebody else, for someone's life. Then I suddenly realized that I haven't written anything about the spatial constructs which hold grief, perhaps because they cannot be clearly defined, measured, held, and materialized. There are technologies which both cause death and hold to ransom the rituals for the living to contemplate death, but the spaces which hold grief are everywhere and nowhere. The spaces which hold grief are under sky, or under roof, or under water, or under tent flap, or under rubble, or under duress, or under the influence, or under threat, or under orders, or under the sallow exterior light of midnight bathrooms. As part of my repetitious search, I visited 2 cemeteries and drove past a third. I always imagine that ghosts sometimes cling to me when I leave, but that is absurd. Why would they want to leave the peace and quiet of the graveyard? The etymology of the word cemetery is sleeping place. It is not only burial ground. And culturally, geographically, and historically, it is referred to by many names. I was going to talk about how the dust clings after a funeral service at the gravesite, how my body is always tired after a funeral, how I couldn't find the names of anyone familiar at these cemeteries I visited, even though I've been there multiple times, how I noticed where the fence around the one I drove past has disappeared. I think maybe the fence was sold for scrap metal, unless it's being replaced by something more secure or supposedly impenetrable. Why would you need to secure a graveyard? I wanted to say that there was this urgency to find the name of someone familiar in the places I visited, lest it seem I was trespassing. It felt that way, and I told myself to act like I had business there. I did. I didn't. I don't. But I do. The air at cemeteries is still and quiet and heavy. It always feels to me as though there's a bubble of some kind around them, even on hot, windy, rainy, or cold days. I wanted to say these things, but I was alone that day, so I didn't tell anyone anything. Footnotes. Footnote 1. Grieving exists as materiality in technology and psychology. Catastrophe is loss at an often indescribable scale. To grieve each individual is to grieve infinitely, or to activate quantum grief. This quantum entanglement is observable when a particle of grief can be linked, so the state of one instantly influences the other, regardless of the distance separating them. To grieve loss of place, one at a time, is to grieve all geographies at planetary scale, ecosystemically. The racialized body gets trapped in segregated time, when that body was or is peripheral, and so it lingers in the subaltern along with its marginalized, segregated, rebellious placement. Footnote 2. Affective loss exists as both visceral and emotional response and reaction. It is not just jagged, crying, howling tears. It is felt in muscle and bone. It affects the chemical composition of the corporeal. There is a sensation of the chthonic pull to the dark and warm center of the earth before there's a pull anywhere else. I'm not sure if this is learned behavior. Footnote 3. Tactile mourning exists as apartheid spatial segregation and its artifacts or aftermaths. My maternal grandmother could not attend her sister's funeral. Cemeteries were segregated by race and religion, and my great-grandmother's sister presented as white, while my great-grand, who married a dark-skinned Indian man, was therefore presented as other. She was therefore disallowed and unsanctioned. Tangential to this tactile mourning, I've been reading No Place to Rest by Dineo Skasana, in which she captures and reflects the bureaucracy of dying, which is ensconced in belief and tradition and custom and culture. Her writing unpacks an important piece of legislation which I am encountering more frequently in my practice as an architect, because it is related to the value and aging of built or spatial infrastructures. She traces the origins of the National Heritage Resources Act, which is legislation drawn from Roman Dutch law, which in its turn is the foundation of our legal system, but which was also imported by the colonial regimes, which in its turn references religious texts. This legislation regulates the resting place of certain remains after death. In her examination of the Act, Dineo has recognized that it has several loopholes, and when exploited, violate the cultural constitutional rights of previously marginalized communities. She has also noted that the legislation is broadly viewed as progressive, just as the South African Constitution is. But in reality, she notes, and I quote, the legislation does not sufficiently provide for intangible heritage and indigenous beliefs. It is an indictment on a colonial history and an archiving of the overly generous perpetual apartheid gift of dispossession which keeps on giving. These themes of dispossession of land and culture in death, the power of capital as performed by the mining industrial complex, and the continued exploitation of Blackness echoes the precarity of the cultural rituals in general and burial beliefs in particular. Beliefs such as treating human remains with respect, as well as performing traditional rituals and ceremonies to appease the ancestors. In this legislation, she identifies one of the loopholes that particularly affects me as an architect practicing in Johannesburg. Buildings, structures, artifacts, or culturally significant sites like graves are only deemed of heritage value if they are more than 60 years old. Quite easy to achieve with buildings in terms of protecting them or regarding them as valuable. Not so simple with grave sites. The 60-year rule has allowed property developers to exploit this loophole, allowing relocation of graves to be carried out by undertakers and not anthropologists as the legislation demands. This has happened particularly where contested mining land is located in close proximity to their dormitory towns, which were another implementation of apartheid urban planning. This exploitative practice in mining landscapes connects not only to the policy of heritage and the heritage of policy, but also to land rights and to apartheid laws of disenfranchisement, All these land-based policies refer to and reference each other, from mining resettlement guidelines which move people off their ancestral or historically designated lands, to the Restitution of Land Act, to the Land Use Management Act. They all hold contention and conversation with apartheid-era land assignation and capital. As an illustration, I'm showing you an image from a newspaper, online news article from July of 2011, written by the journalist Sean Smiley. He writes, "The occupant of grave 127 no longer has a name. His name has slipped from living memory as the decades passed and a mine dump swallowed the cemetery where he was buried. The skeleton could be of one of as many 650 bodies that archaeologists will have to exhume from the cemetery in Crown Mines, about 4 kilometers from the center of Johannesburg. The mystery is that there's no apparent record of this graveyard, which at the turn of the 20th century could have been one of the largest in the city. This was not a haphazard cemetery. People were buried in neat rows," recalls the archaeologist that was appointed. The cemetery was discovered in October of 2011 when mine security noticed human bones sticking out of the ground. The area was once covered by a mine dump, but earth-moving equipment recently uncovered these remains to extract any remaining gold. From what they have discovered so far, the archaeologist Peltzer believes the cemetery was in use from the 1890s until the 1920s. They have exhumed about 70 skeletons, which have been examined and then taken to undertakers, where the bones are to be stored until reburial. The reburial site is yet to be identified. From the 70 exhumations, Peltzer and his team have been able to draw a profile of the occupants of the cemetery. They were men aged between 18 and 25. The man in grave 127 was likely one of the 63,000 laborers who were brought from northern China between 1904 and 1910 to work on the mines. Historical records paint a picture of the mines and mine compounds as being death traps, where laborers lost their lives in rockfalls or dynamite explosions or succumbed to diseases. The archaeologist is quoted as saying, "These guys were just seen as commodities, and at the end of the day, they were forgotten." That's where the article ends. I am loath to feel grief. It weighs more than I can carry. No, it weighs more than I want to carry. Grief and mourning and sadness changes the way food and life and water and breath and words and living tastes. Grief is both generator and consequence of anger. Grief is multiplicity, both loud and quiet, empty and full. It is an ironically living, breathing, walking around thing. Grief creates defiance. Grief creates resistance. To contemplate the systems of grief is to weave the illusion of control over our emotions. Where are the spaces to hold this infinite sorrowing? Grief intervenes in the making of public memory. When grief is shared, it creates collective access and discursive platform for recollection, an archive and representation of records for the marginal, the peripheral, the obliterated, the removed, the erased, executed, and the deliberately silenced. The spaces of grieving are cartographic as memory is, in marking the spaces in which grieving is more acute or less acute. That the entire surface of the world has become this overlay of mapped, lost, and erased memories. That there is an epistemic grieving of the loss of the known things of the past, held in the libraries of people, and people as repositories of memory, and language, and time, and joy. That the acoustic quality of space might amplify grief and grieving, and sound, which is analogous to loss and mourning. Throughout this talk, I've used flowers as an obscuring device, as censoring element, a filter over the destruction or pain or unnamed thing. But you would have noticed there are almost all flowers in some state of decay. The slowly decaying flowers is an exponential measurement of the slow grieving necessary for healing or some kind of repair. As the flowers fade, one notices the softening of smell, color, and form. In the temporariness, they revolve around grief. Many years back, my mom used to do flower arranging, but her hands can't cope with the strain of that anymore. I never knew the names of the flowers in these arrangements. Our house was often fragrant with blooms in several buckets, and I never questioned their existence. They probably came from that lady with the yellow house, with the yellow painted walls and dark passages impossibly filled with flowers and things. It never struck me as odd that my house was filled with things for flower arrangements and so many beautiful pieces. Trying to find the places my mom bought her flowers here in Johannesburg, this flower market in Adderley Street in Cape Town popped into my algorithm. A month ago, the flower sellers who have sold here for generations, probably over 150 years, are under threat of losing their space. The city wants to impose a ban on informal traders, which is how these sellers are now being defined. Is this a strategy to remove the women and families of color from the city due to an upgrade of the market? The market space was gifted to the flower sellers in the 1800s. This economic violence perpetuates spatial violence and racial violence framed as progress. Violence births grieving, perpetual mourning, loss, and deliberate absence. Yes, I'm stating the obvious, but no, it must be said. Violence births grief, and so we are always in some state of grief. Loss, pain, whatever else rips you from rest, sleep, and joy. Grieving interrupts safety, futures, security, daylight, the laughter of children, innocence, sleeping, dancing, warmth, rain, and truth. Grief reminds us that loss is felt in skin and bone and muscle and cannot be denied, that pain and suffering of absence is not imaginary. Grief is improvisational. When there is a need to carve out a space for observing a ritual, when there is no public space or there is limited room, as there was for the funeral of my mom's aunt, then people improvise. A white tent cover was erected in a gap between the laundry yard and the front doors of their neighbors. The family gathered under the rain, under the tent, to observe the required processes. The gap became a site to hold grief, collective sadness, and the slowly emptying archive of a life lived quietly in a small apartment on the first floor of a block in a neighborhood which hasn't changed for half a century. To witness grief is also to lend our agency and skills where needed, as evidenced in this conference and in the small pockets of activism where resources are low and people know they can only depend on themselves or strangers who are stubborn about justice. There is an informal settlement a block away from my office, which has existed for over a decade. I recently was able to visit it with some colleagues to find out that there are a couple of people who are not architects who are donating their time, money, and energy to make small but impactful interventions in that space. They've installed solar power so people can charge their phones. They cleaned up space for vegetable gardens because food security is always urgent. And they hacked into the old sewer system to ensure flushing toilets and made a safe space for a daycare center for the children in that space. In these instances, there is no need to negotiate with power or request permission. Urgency requires subterfuge and innovation. It also throws into the spotlight a challenge to what architects are trained to do. These flowers gathered here are frozen echoes of life in color, in breath, in communion with the collective, which is land and memory and past and present, and ashes and dust and time and interstellar sparkly stuff. Of course, the flowers are always already gone, and us in our superiority extend their flawless perfection to convey something which we cannot speak. So we offer these sacrificial petals as some kind of affection for our prosthetic trauma, which are sometimes hidden, quiet, forgotten things, waiting for the beautiful things to wither and fade, and for something else to be revealed and seen and revered. When we care to see that disenchantment and dissatisfaction with the governments and infrastructures infrastructures in so-called post-colonial or post-apartheid spaces like the city I live in, I feel there's a kind of grief which incites this. The selective spatial neglect in some municipalities, the choice by residents to refuse to pay for services, the legacy of incomplete promises which reappear at every new pre-election campaign, exposes the denialists who embrace a narrative that apartheid never existed or does not exist or is manufactured, or that architecture and its spatialities is a neutral act. All spatial practice is a political act. The work of grief is to activate resistance at all scales, in the body, in the home, in the street, in the urban, in public spaces, in spaces where loss is most evident. You cannot escape grief because it is tethered to love. To grief is to expand, and therefore your capacity to love expands, and to hold for others and to transform grief is felt and carried. Thank you for listening.